Finally, I'm Todd for G66. Welcome to another Tuesday Tone Tip. Today, we're going to tackle something that has been long requested, and that is how to compensate between different guitars on the same preset. We're on the FM3 today, and I want to give you a couple of different ways I would approach this particular problem. The first one is that I actually don't really see this as a problem. I have different guitars because they sound different, and if I'm going to play a Les Paul, I'm going to dial in a preset for the Les Paul. If I wanted to plug a Strat into that preset and have a listen to what it sounds like, kind of already accepted that it's just kind of going to sound different and it's going to sound like a Strat. But I do understand that if you're swapping guitars live at a gig, for example, and you don't want to be constantly swapping presets, you want to kind of keep your gain levels similar and you don't want a massive difference across your tones. We can deal with that, and we'll deal with it today. We'll start with the Friedman BEV3. I'm running that into one of my own cab impulses, and I'm using the London Plate reverb. The amp's at stock settings, and it sounds like this. It's a great rock and roll amp, the BE, whichever version you go with. I tend to like V3 with this particular guitar. So that's the tone I've got with my Les Paul. This has some PAF style pickups in it. What I'm going to do is drop a looper block before the amp here, and I'm going to record a sample of this guitar. So the way I'm going to do that is I'll set up the looper so that the record threshold is somewhere up here. I'll hit record. This arms the looper, but it's not looping yet. It will only start when it actually detects an input from my guitar. And I'll just play a couple of simple chords. Okay, I've done that. Now I'm gonna swap to my Strat. Okay, so this is my Strat. This is what it sounds like straight into the amp. It's not far off. It does just sound like a Strat as opposed to a Les Paul, but there is slightly less gain. Let's check the Les Paul sample again. Now, this is how I would go about compensating between the discrepancy in gain there. I would go to the input block and I would change the output level of this block. Let's try 3 dB with the Strat. We'll have a listen to that and then we'll compare it to the Les Paul again. It's not too far off. There's a little bit more gain. It's pushing the front end of the amp just a little bit harder. And the thing I like about this is it is first thing in the chain. So if I was using, say, compressors and drive blocks before the amp, this is acting before all of that. If you don't have those in there, you could use the amp block input trim. It is going to achieve the same thing, but I like doing it in the input block. Now, let's say I want to switch between this on the fly. I could do one of two things. I could have channel A on this particular block totally stock, and if I switch from my Les Paul to my Strat, I'll change the channel on the input block so that it has a 3 dB boost. That means I would have to assign a foot switch of some sort to toggle between those two channels. But what I prefer doing is assigning a control switch. So I'm gonna go control switch number 1 right here. Let's turn the minimum value up so it's somewhere around 0 and the maximum so it's somewhere around 3. That will do. And what I'm going to do right now is actually assign a per preset foot switch for this one. So let's go per preset FC. I'll make this a control switch. I want it to be a latching control switch, and it's control switch number 1. And what I'll do on my FC controllers, I'm on view number 1, which is, layout number 1, view number 1, which I've got for scenes. I'm just quickly going to override this particular preset right here with that control switch. So what I've got now is a latching control switch that when I turn it on is going to give me an upfront 3 dB boost. So I can go from this Les Paul levels of gain, and then when I swap to my Strat, I've got that extra boost. That's how I would do it. It's a nice way to get around adding an extra block to the grid, and it's using a control switch, which means if I set this up per scene so that each scene just looks at the last setting of the control switch, means I don't have to go through every scene and reassign the channels. This is going to apply across all of my scenes, which is what we want when we swap guitars. I don't need a new preset, I don't need any new blocks on the grid, and it's happy days. Now, we could get slightly more granular with this and try to actually compensate not just for the output level, but for some EQ differences between the guitars. Generally speaking, the single coil pickups on a Strat have a higher resonant frequency than those on a Les Paul. So let's do this. I'm going to unassign this control switch, and we are going to drop a parametric EQ first on the grid. So this is the option where we do add some stuff to the grid. And this guitar with the Cert ML pickups actually has a resonant frequency around 3500 hertz with these particular pots. It's going to change from guitar to guitar, and this is going to be super crude, by the way. This is kind of a hacky way to get around this, but I'll show you what we can do. We can go 3500 hertz here, and we can pull out some gain from there with this peaking EQ. Now, a Les Paul with PAFs is going to have a resonant frequency around 2 to 3K, so let's just add in some 2500. Like I said, this is kind of hacky and crude, but it's gonna do the thing that we want. And I'll go for some kind of sharper cues with these as well. So you can experiment with these values, but basically, this is my best attempt at compensating between the character between those two guitars. And now, let's add that 3 dB of level in there. So I go from my straight up Strat sound, so by adding in this 2500 hertz, it's kind of fattening everything up, and by pulling out this 3500 hertz, it's getting rid of a bit of that kind of Strat quack. Let's have a listen to our reference Les Paul. So it doesn't sound exactly like my Les Paul, but it sounds a little less like a Strat, which is something that may be desirable. Like I said, my personal preference would just be to use that input EQ and a control switch so that we can just compensate for any gain differences up front, but you can experiment with this kind of resonant frequency simulation. Like I said, this is quite crude. It's just using EQs in there. The resonant frequency of a pickup is going to depend on the pickup itself and the type of pots and like your guitar cable and issues like capacitance. But this is kind of cool, and it's kind of fun to experiment like that. You can just use this even as a kind of, you know, pre-gain boost and experiment with these methods. But if we still wanted to have that thing where it carries across scenes, I would just assign the bypass to a control switch as well. So if I was playing my Les Paul and I kick that control switch on, no, I want it off. So the control switch is off and the PEQ is bypass, as you can see there. Then I'm going to turn the control switch on and the PEQ comes on. And like I said earlier, we look at controllers and we set the CS1 state to be last across all the scenes. And this is going to act globally across our scenes. So that's what I would do in that particular situation if you have different sounding guitars with different gain levels with different characters and you just wanted to bridge that divide a little bit live. Let me know if this works for you or if this is something you've attempted in the comments. I would love to hear from all of you, and as always, thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next Tuesday for another Tuesday Tone Tip. Cheers.